The Bacchae is one of the most enduringly popular Greek tragedies all the way up to the modern day, and yet millennia after it was written, there's still no consensus on what it means. This isn't to say that there aren't obvious themes in the play: frenzy, madness, the relation between state and religion, allegories for Greek history, but to this very day, the play retains a mysterious quality and can enthrall even modern readers. What is easy to understand is the Bacchae's popularity, because compared to the language of the Agamemnon, for example, the Bacchae is light reading. It's an exciting story. It's full of wonders and horrors and some iconic images that we associate with Greek mythology and the cult of Dionysus. And in comparison to the Oresteia, the motivations of the characters and who is in the right and who's in the wrong seems, at least at first glance, to be far more straightforward. The Bacchae is the tale of the god Dionysus. He returns from Asia to Thebes to establish his worship, his cult, and he is opposed by Pentheus, the stubborn king who refuses to acknowledge that Dionysus is a god. For this offense, Dionysus kills Pentheus and destroys his house. And house here means both his literal palace and his bloodline. Dionysus destroys both. That is more or less the entirety of the story. Dionysus himself explains to us in the introduction what is going to happen in the play, and in the Deus Ex Machina at the end, he tells us what will happen after it's over. There would seem to be little ambiguity in the story. And yet, upon a closer examination, things are a bit more complicated than that, and this is why the story continues to fascinate. After one experiences the Bacchae, the events of which seemed so straightforward as they unfold in the course of the story, one can get the sense that perhaps not everything was as it seemed, that certain aspects of the story that at first seemed reasonable begin to appear irrational. We begin to notice the loose ends. And I would argue that the Bacchae is one of those stories that gets more interesting the longer and harder you think about it. It gets more complicated in a way. And this is, in my opinion, the genius of Euripides, because Dionysus is, after all, a god of illusions. This is in the opposite sense of Apollo being a god of illusions. The Apollonian sense of illusions are dreams and representations. But Dionysus conjures ecstasy and self-forgetting. He conjures fleeting sensations and feelings, states of mind that dominate totally, absorbing you into the moment, making you forget about the past and the future and everything you know beyond the immediate perception or sensation. And Dionysus momentarily changes the nature of our reality thereby, so profoundly that he can make the impossible possible. Man reverting to beast, miracles out of the natural world, even superhuman strength. In a sense, Dionysus is the repudiation of the supposedly objective, orderly, rational world. He shows us that this supposedly intelligible world of ours is something that we're actually imposing upon reality, that the real reality for us is in fact only our sensation, and our conceptualization of the world and its order is a mere veil to cover over this inexplicable chaos, which is the truth of nature. And so in the same way, while it seems that on the stage we're witnessing the story of a prideful king defying the gods and being justly punished, it's only after the fact, after the powerful images of miracles and the horrifying scenes of savagery have washed over us, so to speak, that we begin to wonder, what have we really just witnessed? The playwright Euripides is an important figure from the standpoint of Nietzsche's philosophy. Before we comment on that, though, we'll consider the basic details of Euripides' life. He was one of the three great tragedians of Athens. During the Golden Age of Athens, Sophocles and Aeschylus would have been considered the greatest tragic playwrights of the city, and Euripides would have been a close and definitive third. Sophocles, as we know, won the first prize at the Dionysia 18 times, and Aeschylus 13. But Euripides only wins 4. Nevertheless, posterity would be kinder to Euripides. As Greece entered the Hellenistic period, what Nietzsche calls the Alexandrian period, this is following the Macedonian conquests of Philip and Alexander, the popularity of Euripidean drama soon eclipsed the works of Sophocles and Aeschylus. And in the grand scheme of things, even though Euripides only gains third-place prominence in his own day, like when the tragedies are written, more of his works survive than any other tragic playwright, including Sophocles or Aeschylus. And I think most artists would therefore prefer the fate of Euripides, insofar as winning the prize at the festival in the moment is great and all, but the popularity of Euripides during the Hellenistic period basically ensured that more of his work was preserved near the end of antiquity, and so his plays simply had a longer lasting appeal, and because of that, we have more of them. So why was this? Why did Euripides appeal more during the Hellenistic period? Well, listeners of the podcast ought to know Nietzsche's explanation from Birth of Tragedy by now, but here is a refresher. Socrates is the beginning of a new theoretical age in Greece. With Socrates and his line of students, Plato, Aristotle, and so on, Greece becomes a more rationalist civilization. And Aristotle tutors Alexander the Great himself. And the Hellenistic period becomes known as overall less creative and more derivative of what came before, at least in terms of the arts and literature. This is a period during which scientific thought flourishes. The Greeks begin to catalog what came before. They begin to interpret past works from Hellenic Greece, the time of Sophocles. And they write encyclopedias, and they build the Library of Alexandria, and so on and so forth. But there are no playwrights really on the level of the three great Athenian tragedians. The work of Euripides resonates with this age, according to Nietzsche, because Euripides is a student of Socrates. He brings about the death of tragedy by fundamentally altering what tragedy is. The influence of Socrates on Euripidean drama is key to Nietzsche's interpretation. Socrates felt rather negatively about Sophocles, and for that matter about Homer and Hesiod, most of the great poets and playwrights of antiquity. Socrates and Plato famously have a negative view of tragedy overall because of its inherent pessimism. If poetry and plays are supposed to be ethical instruction, which they were in the Greek world, well, then simply put, this is bad instruction from the Socratic point of view. It makes men worse if they are to believe that, for example, the pursuit of truth will lead you to ruin, or that a man might be perfectly virtuous and heroic but still be fated to be destroyed. One could argue that even if such propositions are true, it might still be better to inspire men to virtue by suggesting that a virtuous life is a happy life, a rewarding life. That might be a noble lie that one ought to tell, rather than the fatalistic message that no matter how virtuous you are, you can't escape your fate, right? So that Socratic attitude is basically, in so many words, to oversimplify it, anti-tragedy, and famously, the dramas of Euripides are the only dramas that Socrates attends. So Euripides is different. He's still a tragedian, but in Nietzsche's view, he's sort of a transitional form to the new Attic comedy. Now, Euripides makes a number of innovations on the tragic form that would be incredibly popular and are the source of Nietzsche's criticism. For one, he minimizes the role of the chorus, and that's perhaps the main reason why Nietzsche dislikes him, because the chorus, ever since ancient times, had been the foundation of the Greek drama. In its early incarnations, the earliest incarnations, the entire drama was nothing but chorus. The chorus sings the action in the story. It's a kind of spontaneous, poetic conjuring of a mythic scene. And Nietzsche goes so far as to say that in these dithyrambic performances, there were perhaps mass hallucinations brought about by the lyricism of the chorus. And the dithyrambic poetic form is always accompanied by wine, and it was originally part of Dionysus's ecstatic religious rites. So perhaps as the chorus was describing, for example, the Titans dismembering the god Dionysus, maybe the chorus and the spectators can enter this kind of trance state and actually see Dionysus being ripped asunder. It's only later that the event is dramatized by actors. And so for Nietzsche, and probably for the traditionalist Hellenic Greek as well, minimizing the role of the chorus is a kind of heresy. It's a failure to understand that the chorus has this essential role of conjuring the scene and really stirring the passions such that one enters the kind of frenzied state in which they can even feel or sense the scene. The chorus puts the audience into the state of mind such that they're willing to imprint the character of a god or a hero onto the masked actor. Nietzsche describes the chorus as a kind of magic circle, the wall between the audience and the action on the stage, They are the ones who maintain the illusion that the drama is real. They create this elevated world of art between our mundane reality and the supramundane world of the Olympians. But with Euripides, the role of the chorus becomes far less pronounced. They cease to be a strange mix between poetic commentators and actors within the events. The main characters act and react, but in Euripides, the chorus doesn't really intervene. Rarely do they even attempt to convince or persuade the main characters of anything, which is sort of a staple of the chorus's interventions. Often they're simply persuading the hero to a course of action. Furthermore, in Nietzsche's words, the Euripidean drama moves beyond the fatalistic tragedy of previous works, in which the noble man does not sin, but is nevertheless destroyed as a demand of fate. In Euripidean drama, as Nietzsche puts it, the human condition is confined within a limited sphere of solvable problems. Euripides infuses a moral into his dramas. And he also preferred not to use larger-than-life heroes as his protagonists, but ordinary people. Even when they are great kings or warriors, they are portrayed as essentially down-to-earth human beings with ordinary and relatable thoughts and feelings. And so one might say Euripides takes the grand and he brings it down to the level of the ordinary, which is really the opposite of what Nietzsche felt tragedy should do. He thought this completely flew in the face of the spirit of tragedy, which ought to take the ordinary person in the audience and elevate him up to the perspective of grandeur. For Nietzsche, tragedy attains its zenith at the place where the best human being meets the worst fate, without his fate being tied to a moral condemnation on his person. For Euripides, the tragedy is instead, the formula for tragedy, we might say, is something more like the ordinary, relatable person thrown into an incredible and overwhelming situation. And it's worth noting that's the kind of story we tend to enjoy today. The everyman who is thrown into a great trial, or into a novel setting, or into a grave danger that he doesn't fully understand. That's the plot of so many Hollywood stories, and in that way the spirit of Euripides lives on. He modernizes the tragic form, and in his hands, Greek tragedy moves, I would say it takes its final steps away from its origin, its roots in religious ritual, and becomes something closer to what we in the modern day would recognize as drama. Another thing that Euripides is frequently criticized for, not just by Nietzsche, is the deus ex machina. You probably know that term today to refer to a plot device. It means God in the machine, and that means the sudden intervention into the story of a plot element in which the main character has no hand. So, through no action of the protagonists, a plot point is resolved by some sudden and almost miraculous happening. But that's the term deus ex machina as a plot device, but that's not what Euripides is necessarily criticized for, although it is related, I guess we would say. The way the term originates is that they would quite literally use a machine, a crane, to lower the actor portraying a god within the drama, to lower them down onto the stage. They would seem to descend from the heavens. Euripides was certainly not the first playwright to use this convention. Aeschylus uses it in the Eumenides. If I recall correctly, that's when Athena appears. But Euripides used this convention so much that even in his own time, people poked fun at him for overusing it. For example, in one of Aristophanes' plays, he makes Euripides a character in the play, and he has Euripides enter the stage via the deus ex machina, which I think is hilarious. And we see this in the Bacchae as well. Not only does Dionysus come onto the stage at the beginning and identify himself as a god, and give us a prologue in which he tells us exactly what's going to happen and what he's going to do. That's sort of another trademark of Euripidean drama. He, far more than any of the other tragedians, opens the play with a god coming onto the stage to tell us what's going to happen. But Dionysus also appears at the end, lowered into the action with the crane to explain the ending. So the Bacchae is, in this respect, a prototypical example of Euripidean drama, or an archetypal example of it, at least as regards the use of the god in the machine. Euripides does this in almost all the extant plays of his that we have. And so, in short, the Nietzschean critique of Euripides is that he takes the ritual religious elements out of drama, or he at least reduces them, in favor of functional storytelling, the moral of the story, and so on. And he reduces the heroes to ordinary people. I would argue, maybe not to the degree that Nietzsche might suggest that he does, but he does tilt in that direction. And he overuses the explicit, the somewhat on-the-nose devices of storytelling and the stage device of the Deus Ex Machina. Nietzsche compares this to the developments of modern opera in his own time, in which the libretto had taken on central importance, and in which the composition was no longer music, which carried words that only borrowed their power from the music, but rather the opera became a story told through lyrics in which the music, which is the ecstatic and the artistically powerful element of opera, that is all reduced in importance in favor of promoting or putting forward a more easy-to-understand, straightforward narrative. So how are we, Nietzsche disciples, to think about Euripidean drama? For my part, I think Nietzscheans should be a little bit easier on Euripides than they tend to be, at least those of us who do have strong opinions on Euripides. And really what I mean is, like, some people commented when I said I was covering Euripides and said things like, well, I've never touched Euripides because Nietzsche didn't like it, or Nietzsche gave me a negative opinion of Euripides, some variation on that theme. And I don't think it's exactly fair to treat Euripides that way, because I think if Nietzsche was around today, and if you asked him to compare Euripides to most contemporary art, I think he would almost certainly prefer Euripides to the vast majority of art and media that has been created in the last 100 years. Relative to Sophocles, Nietzsche would think Euripides is inferior. But relative to the vast majority of literature, I'm sure he would hold Euripides in high honor, in spite of his cultural associations with Socrates and the fact that he may have hastened Greek civilization down the road of becoming more rational and theoretical. Further, we have to remember that Nietzsche had his own agenda in making this attack on Euripides. He was attacking the conventions of modern opera by drawing that comparison. So the portrait he crafts of Euripides is not an objective one. I don't think even Nietzsche would claim that. He crafts a certain image of Euripides that was useful according to his needs in Birth of Tragedy, for the purposes of drawing a comparison between Euripidean drama and the degeneration of opera. And that move is part of a larger Wagnerian project. Nietzsche's praise of Wagner as the greatest composer of his time, and a man who, in his Schopenhauerian wisdom, returned to the primordial power of music as the center of the dramatic experience. But Nietzsche would go on to repudiate basically all of those opinions that drove his work in Birth of Tragedy. He eventually rejects Wagner. He rejects Schopenhauer. And he comes to see much of his thinking in that book as flawed, as stained by Schopenhauerian formulations and smelling offensively Hegelian. So it's not even clear to me that Nietzsche's critique of Euripides should be viewed as final, as an essentially Nietzschean position. It's a position he takes at a given time for reasons that have as much to do with Wagner and modern opera as they have to do with a clear-headed, sober reading of Euripides himself. But with all that being said, we haven't really talked about the worst offense of Euripides from Nietzsche's standpoint that takes place in this play, the Bacchae. And that's the fact that he does portray Dionysus on the stage as a human being. The play takes place in Thebes. Cadmus, if we'll remember from Oedipus Rex, is the legendary founder of Thebes. Dionysus returns to Thebes because he's a descendant of Cadmus, through Cadmus's daughter Semele. Semele had sex with Zeus. Dionysus was born from this union. Dionysus appears as a mortal man at the beginning of the play. In its very first lines, he walks on stage, identifies himself to us, the audience. Quote, "I am Dionysus, the son of Zeus, come back to Thebes, this land where I was born. My mother was Cadmus's daughter, Semele by name, midwived by fire, delivered by lightning's blast. And here I stand, a god incognito, disguised as a man, beside the stream of Dirce and the waters of Ismenus." End quote. So, again, if we were to compare this type of introduction to the enigmatic verses of the Watchman at the beginning of the Agamemnon, the ruminations of the chorus as they wander in the dead of night at the temple, sort of reflecting on the history of Agamemnon and the mythological history of the Theogonies. From the start, Dionysus is perhaps a bit too ordinary. He's too human. His main motivation seems to be to punish those who didn't believe his mother Semele actually birthed a child fathered by Zeus. So not only does he appear as an ordinary mortal man, he's also motivated by something very human, which could be construed as a kind of resentful feeling towards those who didn't believe his mother's word. Why would Nietzsche have a problem with this portrayal? Well, Dionysus in Nietzsche's view is an encounter with a numinous experience. That's what Dionysus symbolizes. The Dionysian is the destruction of self and other, a breakdown of the ego and a communion with the primordial pain and contradiction at the heart of reality. Dionysus in this way is less like a human being and more like a force of nature. Containing him in this human vessel who struts about the stage and tells us exactly who he is and what he's motivated by, and who plots and who resents his mother's disgrace by the Thebans, doesn't this justify Nietzsche's critique of Euripides? We're going to table that question for now because I'm going to give an analysis of the play that would dispute that kind of interpretation. That in fact, Dionysus is not all that he seems in this tragedy. In fact, I would even go so far as to argue that the Dionysian force of nature, synonymous with this ecstatic experience of self-forgetting, is best portrayed by Euripides, and that he shows on stage the reality of the Dionysian better than any other playwright. And perhaps Nietzsche might well have said that in itself is part of the problem, because the Bacchae, in a profound way, is a celebration of tragedy itself, that it is to some extent a meta-tragedy. Dionysus is the god of theater, and in essence the god of tragedy. It is in his religious rite that tragedy originates. He's the original tragic hero. Well, here he is on stage, in effect, directing the course of a tragedy. The play can be seen as a comment on tragedy, and that in itself is to make explicit the elements of tragedy that might have been previously implicit or even unconscious in previous plays. That act of making explicit is one of Nietzsche's problems with Euripides, his very act of bringing the tragic themes into our conscious awareness so that he can comment on them. That would certainly seem to herald the coming of the Hellenistic age, in which art and writing was all a commentary on what came before. For Nietzsche, it is the ecstatic experience itself that's the causa finalis of tragedy, the willing entrance into a mass hallucination within which knowledge and consciousness are forgotten. Euripides and his intellectualizing about tragedy is necessarily a degeneration on tragedy and not its advancement. And again, so I wanted to give Nietzsche his due so that we all understand the nature of his problems with Euripidean drama. But at the same time, I also want to show the incredible value of the Euripidean drama and his great success at playing with these themes, giving new meaning to the familiar tragic themes. Euripides does stand at the threshold of a new era for Greece, and he's not like the tragic playwrights who came before him. But this play is one of the most entertaining Athenian tragedies, and of course the play is a later era's retrospective understanding of the meaning of the Dionysian. Euripides is inevitably standing at a later point in history and looking back on this event, what we might call the coming of Dionysus into Greece, an event that occurs in the hazy early days of the Greek culture. But nevertheless, Euripides gives us this wonderful representation of the Dionysian crashing into Hellas like a tidal wave, and that's why I say it's perhaps the best portrayal of Dionysus, not the literal human figure walking on the stage, but the events of the play that show how destructive and chaotic it must have been when what we call the Dionysian came crashing into the Greek culture. And so you can see the Bacchae as the story of the founding of the Dionysus cult, who is the newest Olympian god. He's the youngest of the Olympian gods. All the Greeks acknowledge that fact. It's a sort of allegorical retelling that completely holds with the historical understanding put forward by Nietzsche, in fact. Dionysus is a god that came from Asia, and the Dionysian is not even properly Greek. That is represented here as Dionysus tells how he has established his cult in Lydia and in Arabia and across the steppes of Persia. Quote, "Across all Asia's swarming littoral of towered cities where Greeks and foreign nations mingling live, my progress made. There I taught my dances to the feet of living men, establishing my mysteries and rites, that I might be revealed on earth for what I am, a god. And thence to Thebes, this city, first in Hellas, now shrills and echoes to my women's cries, their ecstasy of joy. Here in Thebes, I bound the fawn-skin to the women's flesh and armed their hands with shafts of ivy. For I have come to refute that slander spoken by my mother's sisters, those who least had right to slander her. They said that Dionysus was no son of Zeus, but Semele had slept beside a man in love and fathered off her shame on Zeus. A fraud, they sneered, contrived by Cadmus to protect his daughter's name. They say she lied, and Zeus in anger at that lie blasted her with lightning. End quote. There's quite a bit of information here. For one, the Bacchae are the chorus of this play. They're a chorus of Asian women who have come as followers of the cult of Dionysus. Dionysus himself is impersonating a priest of Dionysus, a priest of himself, so they do not know that they actually follow the god incarnate. They think they're following one of his priests. Further, Thebes is the oldest city in Hellas. There's actually evidence that Thebes is among the oldest cities in the Greek world. In fact, the founding of the city by Cadmus is a mythologized event, and so Dionysus is sort of coming to the origins of the Greek culture. He's coming to the epicenter of the Greek culture to establish his cult here. It's said that Cadmus was a Tyrian, or a Phoenician, who brought writing to Greece. Again, there is some truth to this allegorical story. The Greek system of writing seems to have almost certainly been derived from the Phoenician system. Phoenicians also intermingled with the early Hellenes. Some famous figures within Greek history, such as the philosopher Thales of Miletus, may have actually been Phoenicians. It is also said of Cadmus that he defeated the dragon that guarded the spring of Ares. Before the time of Heracles, or before the myths surrounding Heracles attained to sort of the greatest notoriety in Hellenic culture, Cadmus was the greatest slayer of monsters in Greek legend. Athena then advised him to take half of the dragon's teeth and sow them into the ground. These dragon's teeth eventually sprouted into human beings, the Spartoi, which means those who were sown. And these powerful warriors became the founding generation of Thebes. Now, Cadmus had to do a stint of 8 years of slavery under Ares for killing his dragon, and there are all sorts of other stories surrounding Cadmus as well. But his role in founding the city of Thebes is notable because of the influence that this idea would have on Greek culture. We might remember in Plato's Republic, the noble lie that they shall tell the children of this ideal republic is that they were born out of the earth. Human beings spring up out of the ground, and that their worth, their quality is sort of according to what sort of metal they're primarily formed out of. And there's a sense to that kind of myth when we consider the Greek belief that the soul within the corpse continues to live after burial. This is an archaic Greek belief. It's not illustrative of the beliefs of the time around, when Euripides was alive, but in their ancient history. That's how they established these rituals of sustaining their ancestors with libations and burnt offerings. So we go back to the earth after our lives are over. Perhaps that's the distant origin of human beings. Our ancestors came out of the earth. So there's a mythological logic to it. But further, we see in that monologue of Dionysus exactly what motivates him and what he means to avenge. Semele was killed upon asking Zeus to reveal himself in true form. He obliged, and he did reveal himself, but when he did so, the intensity of his visage is so powerful that it incinerates Semele. Dionysus, as he is the progeny of a god, survived the destruction of his mother, and the legend says that Zeus sewed Dionysus into his thigh to carry him to term. This was to avoid the wrath of Hera, who, as we all know, didn't like Zeus fooling around behind her back. Zeus then birthed Dionysus and dropped him off in Asia, where Dionysus begins gathering his cult. So over the course of the play, we will see the Cadmean house which founded Thebes brought down by its own descendant, Dionysus, for not believing in his divine origin. And we will see the Dionysian come crashing into society at large. The events of the play portray the destructive force that Dionysus is when it's unbridled, unchallenged by the Apollonian character of Greek civilization. This is exactly how Nietzsche describes the Dionysian arriving, and the great danger it poses, and the ecstatic rituals that occurred throughout the ancient world. The order of society is thrown into upheaval. Roles are reversed. We see this aspect of the Dionysian in Saturnalia or in the Sacaea of Babylon. Here, in the story of the Bacchae, Dionysus affects this role reversal by transforming the women in the city into super powerful beings who can easily defeat the men in battle. It's a disruption and confusion of the pre-existent gender roles. Further, the Dionysian bends the rules of truth and appearance. From the very beginning, Dionysus does this by choosing to appear as an ordinary human being, deceiving everyone else in the play until the great reveal at the end. The only ones who know that this stranger from Asia is actually Dionysus are we, the audience. Even his Bacchic chorus doesn't know. Throughout the events of the play, Dionysus weaves such illusions, and he brings about madness through his influence. He destroys the ordinary consciousness of the Thebans. He destroys their sanity, and he replaces it with an apparent reality full of violations to the natural order. Mountains dancing, honey bubbling up from the ground, women who can rip a bowl apart with their bare hands. Dionysus reveals that from the moment the play begins, as he is speaking to us, he has already driven the women of Thebes mad. Quote, "I have stung them with frenzy, hounded them from home up to the mountains where they wander, crazed of mind, and compelled to wear my orgy's livery. Every woman in Thebes, but the women only, I drove from home, mad. There they sit, rich and poor alike, even the daughters of Cadmus, beneath the silver firs on the roofless rocks. Like it or not, the city must learn its lesson. It lacks initiation in my mysteries, that I shall vindicate my mother's simile, and stand revealed to mortal eyes as the god she bore to Zeus." End quote. So there is an important fact that we should notice at the outset. Dionysus has the power of illusion. He has the power to drive people mad. But in this play, he uses these powers against his enemies. His Bacchae, the chorus, do not themselves fly into a supernatural rage. They don't engage in orgies. Nor do their lines suggest that they are experiencing a kind of illusory reality. Later in the play, as they hear of the supernatural acts of Dionysus, they respond with praise for the power of their god, but they themselves are not entranced by these same illusions. This is perhaps another reason for Nietzsche's disapproval of Euripides, because he would seem to make the Dionysian frenzy, madness, the destruction of the ego consciousness, he would seem to make all of this into a punishment. Now, I don't think this is necessarily the way we have to interpret the Bacchae. It could be that Dionysus is simply displaying his powers by forcing the Thebans to experience his mysteries in their full destructive force or something like that. The Bacchae, the Asian Bacchae, they don't need such a demonstration because they're already believers. But that doesn't mean that they haven't experienced the Dionysian frenzy in the past. Further, it is worth noting that Dionysus also refers to the women of Thebes as his Bacchae. The chorus are his Asian Bacchae, but at the end of the speech he says, "Now let me go join the whirling dances of my Bacchae in the forests of Mount Kithaeron." So while there is a punitive element in this, it does seem that Dionysus has made the Theban women into genuine Bacchae, that their experience of the Dionysian is, in fact, the entrance into his cult. And so maybe we can get at it this way. As Nietzsche says, everywhere the Dionysian went, it was destructive. By resisting it, you only ensure your own destruction. But by inviting the god in and allowing the expression of Dionysian frenzy within the ritual context, by engaging in his rites, his dances, and so on, which is what Dionysus says he wants to establish here in Hellas, a culture can thereby survive the destruction and incorporate the Dionysian. It can add the Dionysian to its powers. As Nietzsche makes the analogy in Birth of Tragedy, Apollo can take on the power of Dionysus the way Perseus holds up the head of the Gorgon. But at the beginning of this encounter, when the Dionysian rituals first make their way into Greece, we might expect that they would be met with hostility and misunderstanding. And so this play dramatizes the necessary but disastrous first experience with Dionysus. And it's only after this that his rites and dances can be established in a way that doesn't destroy the culture. But in order for the god to be respected in some sense, he has to show his destructive power first to those who at first resist him. After Dionysus leaves to join the dances with the Theban Bacchae in the mountain, his Asian Bacchae enter. They announce to the people of Thebes, "Make way, Dionysus is coming." They sing his praises, and they reinforce the idea that the women of Thebes are not simply being punished, but being inducted into the Dionysian cult by force, we might say. The Bacchae declare, quote, "O Thebes, nurse of simile, crown your hair with ivy, grow green with bryony, redden with berries. O city, with boughs of oak and fir, come dance the dance of God. Fringe your skins of dappled fawn with tufts of twisted wool. Handle with holy care the violent wand of God. And let the dance begin. He is Bromius, who runs to the mountain, where the throng of women waits, driven from shuttle and loom, possessed by Dionysus." End quote. As you read through the utterances of the chorus, you'll notice a number of names used for Dionysus. Bromius is one such name. Bacchus, obviously, is another. Zagreus is a third. Iacchus is another one. But there are many more names than that. There are also other names used for the Bacchae themselves, such as the Maenads. So that is what the meaning of all those words are. In these lines, we have many of the familiar symbols of the Dionysian cult. The crown of ivy, fawn skins, the thyrsus, the wands that they carry. And finally, another thing I want to point out, which is another interesting anthropological point that Euripides seems to clue us into here, references to Cybele and the Corybantian revelers. The chorus says, quote, "Blessed are they who keep the rite of Cybele the mother." And further, quote, "I praise the holies of Crete, the caves of the dancing Euripedes, where Zeus was born, where helmed in triple tier around the primal drum the Corybantes danced." End quote. Cybele is an extraordinarily interesting goddess in terms of how she interacts with the Greek culture. In origin, she is a Phrygian goddess. In fact, she's the only Phrygian goddess that we are aware of, probably because of the fact that she came to be worshipped in Greece and eventually in Rome. Her name means mountain mother, and the Greeks associated her with either Gaia or Rhea, which would be the grandmother and mother of the Olympians, respectively. Phrygia is on the Anatolian Peninsula, and thus she's another Asian goddess who made her way into Hellas. And when we look at aspects of her worship, we see many similarities with the cult of Dionysus. Dionysus usually leads a procession of tigers and panthers. Cybele rides a chariot pulled by lions. So there's this sort of big cat theme. Her rites are associated with wine, music, ecstatic dances. And musically, it's many of the same instruments, the hand drum, the flute, so on and so forth. Ancient writers noticed this connection, and they drew that mythological link between Cybele and Dionysus. After Dionysus was driven mad by Hera, this is one of his stories, that he's driven mad by Hera, a curse that she places upon Dionysus because Hera hates all the illegitimate children of Zeus. After this, Apollodorus says that Dionysus eventually wandered to Phrygia, where he was taken in by Cybele. She purified him of his madness and taught him her holy mysteries and rites. And their disciples are almost like a mirror image of each other. Dionysus has his female bacchantes, who at least in the Euripides version are chaste. Cybele's followers are male eunuchs. And so again, there's this cultural awareness in the work of Euripides, even though he didn't have access to all of our modern anthropological research, right? There's still a deep, perhaps intuitive, maybe intuitive is the wrong word, but just sort of within the cultural memory, this knowledge, all of this comes from Asia, the Dionysian rituals. And so when the chorus of Asian Bacchae declare, quote, "Then from them to Rhea's hands the holy drum was handed down," end quote, they're referring to the hand drum that's part of both Cybele's mysteries and those of Dionysus, and who hands it down? Rhea, the goddess associated with Cybele. Always the wild drumming rhythms are part of these rituals. It's an essential ingredient. And then these lines, quote, "He runs to the mountains of Phrygia. To the mountains of Lydia he runs. He is Bromius who leads us, Evoe," end quote. So again, the reference to the Phrygian connection, the Lydian connection, so the Asia-Anatolian connection. The epithet Bromius is used, one of the names of Dionysus, one of the many names, this sense that Dionysus is sort of a multiple character, a multifarious character. And finally, their worship word, akin to our Christian terms such as hallelujah or amen, evoe. The first character from Thebes that we encounter in the play is none other than old Tiresias. We met Tiresias in Oedipus Rex. If you remember, he told Oedipus that he himself was none other than the murderer of Laius, and Oedipus rebuked him, and he doubted the words of Tiresias, even though Tiresias was correct and Oedipus was in fact the murderer of Laius. But how could this be, as that was during the time of Laius, who was Cadmus's great-great-grandson, and here during the events of the Bacchae, Cadmus is old, but he's still alive. This is not actually a discrepancy between the two plays, because Tiresias is a mythic figure who seemingly always appears as old and blind, but this is because he has an unnaturally long life. We'll explain why that is in a moment, but there's another key feature of the Tiresias character that would have been known to everyone in the audience at the Dionysia watching this play, but that I don't think you would ever pick up just from the text of reading Oedipus Rex or the Bacchae. And that is that Tiresias has had his gender changed by the gods multiple times. As the stories around Tiresias became elaborated upon throughout the years, eventually this number rose to 7 times that he was transformed, from a man into a woman, into a man again, into a woman again, and so on and so forth. As for his blindness, the story is that he was blinded for angering the goddess Hera. Zeus and Hera were having a dispute over which gender experiences the greatest pleasure in sex, and they asked Tiresias, someone who had knowledge of both experiences, and he said that the woman had 10 times the pleasure of a man, and this angered Hera, who was, of course, arguing that the men got the better end of the deal, and because this lost her the argument with Zeus, she blinded Tiresias. Zeus, as a kind of recompense for this, blesses Tiresias with 7 times the lifetime of an ordinary human being. This is how Tiresias can be the blind old prophet way back during the days when Cadmus is alive, and still be the blind old prophet when Oedipus is the king of Thebes. And so, in light of this, there's some significance to the fact that in this story, in which Dionysus throws the social order of Thebes into disorder, particularly when it comes to the gender roles, Tiresias is the first Theban we see who appears on stage, the first human Theban character, dressed in a bacchant's fawn skin and crowned with ivy and carrying a thyrsus, which he uses the way a blind man uses a cane. He calls for Cadmus and says that they have made an agreement that Tiresias is now calling on him to honor. Cadmus emerges from the palace dressed in the same way. He's incredibly old. He's not blind like Tiresias, but he's almost as helpless. He's bent down with age, and he declares his intentions to join Tiresias in going to pay their respects to the god Dionysus. Cadmus says, quote, "Here I am, dressed in the costume of the god, prepared to go. Insofar as we are able, Tiresias, we must do honor to this god, for he was born my daughter's son, who has been revealed to men, the god Dionysus." End quote. And both of these incredibly old men announce that they feel young again, with the power of the Dionysian having come to their city. Cadmus says, quote, "Surely I could dance night and day, untiringly beating the earth with my thyrsus, and how sweet it is to forget my old age." End quote. Tiresias answers, quote, "It is the same with me. I too feel young, young enough to dance." End quote. So there's something fairly straightforward to notice here, given the background of the Tiresias character, but there is also something enigmatic concerning Cadmus. On the one hand, it makes perfect sense that Tiresias would be the first one we see to accept the Dionysian rites, and to even express a kind of enthusiasm for those rites. We see that the power of Dionysus is to make even old men so old that their lives are longer than any of our normal mortal lives, feel young enough to dance. This is the vitality that Dionysus brings to the culture. His ecstasy, his frenzy, has a rejuvenating effect. It's sort of the opposite of the Christian religion and other otherworldly religions that we could say, colloquially or in a paraphrastic way, make the young feel old by force-feeding the ascetic ideal to those of all ages, all genders, all stations in life. The ascetic ideal is more appropriate for older individuals or those on death's door, we might say. The highest ideal in that system is to be passive, to be renunciate of all worldly pleasure. The Dionysian, on the other hand, seemingly has the magical ability to make the old and weary suddenly able to move and dance and to celebrate their physical form. So of course it would be Tiresias who embraces this. Even though all the maenads we have seen so far are female, well, Tiresias has been female, and perhaps multiple times throughout his life. As a figure who is, to use modern terminology, gender fluid, he can easily slip into the role of a maenad. And Cadmus asks, in fact, quote, "Are we the only men who will dance for Bacchus?" End quote. Tiresias answers him with a sentiment that we might find familiar from the Oedipus play, quote, "They are all blind, only we can see," end quote. So obviously a cute little irony there, because he is quite literally blind, but figuratively speaking, he is wiser than everyone around him. He can see more than everyone around him. But with Cadmus, there is something, as I said, unusual here. Not that Cadmus is willing to go along with the worship of Dionysus. That has a kind of sense to it. The odd thing is that Cadmus is one of the ones that Dionysus declares his intention to punish, and does punish in the course of the play. We might ask why. In the first speech of Dionysus, he notes that Cadmus has earned his praise for continuing to honor Dionysus's mother, Semele. And here Cadmus says, "My daughter's son has been revealed to be a god." So Cadmus would seem to acknowledge the godhood of Dionysus, and thus to have believed in Semele where others doubted her. This is one of those aspects of the Bacchae that gets harder to explain the more you think about it. It's one of the mysteries of this tragedy that continues to fascinate. I'll offer a couple of explanations as we go on, but for now, I would just make note of that discrepancy in your mind as we proceed. Cadmus is willing from the beginning to go out and worship Dionysus. And so the two say they'll make their way to the mountain, guiding one another, leaning on one another as two old men. Tiresias says, quote, "The god will guide us there with no effort on our part," end quote. And just as they're about to leave, Tiresias makes some interesting remarks about the current age. We might say the way in which Greece is starting to become more theoretical. Quote, "We are heirs of customs and traditions hollowed by age and handed down to us by our fathers. No quibbling logic can topple them, whatever subtleties this clever age invents. People may say, 'Aren't you ashamed, at your age, going dancing, wreathing your head with ivy?' Well, I am not ashamed. Did the god declare that just the young or the old should dance? No. He desires his honor from all mankind. He wants no one excluded from his worship," end quote. So it's funny, even during the time of Cadmus, things aren't like they used to be. This new age is so clever and full of its new intellectual subtleties, but we old men keep the old traditions. Kind of, it really goes to show you that no matter what age you live in, things were never the same as they used to be, right? At least to the older generations. That's also a strange line because, again, Dionysus is supposed to be a new god. So when they speak of the customs and traditions handed down by their fathers, that no new theoretical approach can topple, what customs and traditions? The very point of the play is that Dionysus is not widely worshipped, and that this is the very story of how he comes into Greece to convert its eldest city, and thereafter all Hellas. So why would Tiresias say this? I think this line actually reveals something about the Greek mentality as concerns the divine, and particularly the adoption of new divinities. For us, and most religious sensibilities of modern times, the idea of changing or updating the religion, or adding new gods, that's all anathema. I mean, probably heretical in most religious traditions. The Book of Revelations famously ends with a curse against any who would alter or remove anything from the text. The Holy Quran declares itself the final revelation of God's will, and Muhammad his final prophet. The Jews are still chanting and studying the same Torah. The situation might be a bit different in the Hindu or Buddhist context, but we'll leave that to one side for now. The point is that this unchanging view of the divine is sort of the opposite of how the Greeks felt. They, in fact, were eager to add new divinities to their pantheons of protector gods. They truly believed you could add new gods to your city's pantheon, and the more you had, the better off your polis was. The very fact that they're willing to import gods from Asia demonstrates this. But as we discussed in the episode on Oedipus, the Greeks would even try to steal the relics, the bones, of heroes from other city-states, because those heroes were understood to have become demigods and thus powerful protective spirits. And they believed that, for instance, if I possess the bones of Theseus, it doesn't even matter if Theseus is from Athens and we're Spartans. He'll become our deity and not theirs. We can literally steal a deity from another city by stealing the bones of the hero. And so I would make the case that what Tiresias is invoking here is this: the customs and traditions that their fathers honored, that Cadmus and Tiresias also honor, is the custom, the tradition of worshiping anyone or anything that has been revealed to have divine power. That the Greek religiosity is founded on this syncretic principle. Wherever you recognize the power of a god, which is to say a power that transcends mankind, the wise man worships that power. He does not fight against it. That is the nature of their polytheism, rather than basing their religion on an unchanging or exclusionary principle. It's based on syncretism. And furthermore, as Tiresias says, every such power wishes for the worship of all. The gods want no one excluded. So the Greek piety worships every divinity which offers itself to Greece. And that is why Greece is so powerful, because they give the gods what they all want. So I would argue they're not referring to the ancient custom of worshiping Dionysus. They're referring to the ancient custom that they honor of worshiping and incorporating new gods. But it's right after this exchange that we meet the character of Pentheus. And Pentheus embodies the exact opposite of this mindset. Pentheus is the grandson of Cadmus, which, if you notice, so is Dionysus, which means he's Dionysus' cousin. And the play notes that he is beardless, which means he is probably right around the age of adulthood, but not by much. He's probably around 18 years of age or so, give or take. And so by our modern standards, if you're that age nowadays and you talk to somebody who's middle-aged or older, they would say, well, he's still just a kid, right? He's probably still got the impulsivity and stubbornness of your average male teenager, and we should keep that in mind throughout the play. Cadmus has abdicated the throne in his old age to the young Pentheus, which means Pentheus is the king of Thebes. He enters and declares his immediate hostility to this figure, this strange young Asian priest, and his bacchantes. Again, Pentheus, along with everyone else, does not know that the stranger is Dionysus himself. He describes the stranger as a foreigner, quote, one of those charlatan magicians with long yellow curls smelling of perfumes, with flushed cheeks and the spells of Aphrodite in his eyes, end quote. Pentheus says he was away from the city of Thebes, but returned when he heard reports of the Theban women running off to the mountains, quote, dancing in honor of the latest divinity, a certain Dionysus, whoever he may be, end quote. Pentheus dismisses this new cult. He says that, quote, I have captured some of them. My jailers have locked them away in the safety of our prison. Those who run at large shall be hunted down out of the mountains like the animals they are. Yes, my own mother, Agave, and Ino, and Autonue. In no time at all I shall have them trapped in iron nets and stop this obscene disorder. End quote. Of the stranger, who's actually Dionysus, he says, by God, I'll have his head cut off. End quote. And just to clarify some names here, Agave, yes, that's Pentheus' mother. Her two sisters are Ino and Autonue. Those are his aunts. So all three of them, the three daughters of Cadmus, have run off with all the other Theban women. And he repeats the story of Semele, arguing that she must have simply had an affair, and Zeus blasted her and her lover with lightning for lying and saying that her lover was Zeus. And the people who promoted this idea, as Dionysus tells us in the beginning, were Agave and Ino and Autonue. These are the main source of the rumor that Semele was simply lying. So remember, Dionysus said that he enchanted all the women of the city. So right there, we already have a clue as to why the likes of Cadmus is included among those who are punished. Because, did it require him seeing his daughters entranced and turned into maenads and effect a demonstration of Dionysus's power in order for Cadmus to believe? Because that would have happened before he and Tiresias suited up in their own fawn skins to go join in the worship. There might be, and this Dionysus gives us some hints of this at the end of the play, there's a sense in which it's already too late. You let this lie about my mother go on too long, and I'm punishing the whole city now, and maybe if you had wanted to avoid it, maybe you should have started worshiping me before I already began the punishment by sending your women off into the woods. Furthermore, we should take note of some of the foreshadowing here when Pentheus says the Bacchae will be hunted down in the mountains like the animals they are. That, in fact, quite the reverse is the case. They, like the animals they are going to hunt down Pentheus. But there's something else about Pentheus that we should notice here that belies the usual explanation of the Bacchae as a play about the established religion versus a new mystical tradition, or the power of the social order being overwhelmed by the raw vitality of nature. There are all these sort of easy explanations of the Bacchae that sort of make Pentheus the archetype of one thing, the old order, and Dionysus the archetype of the new, or something like that. These elements are there, but I think we should take note that Pentheus, according to the religious formula we just proposed, the syncretic principle of the Greek religion, is actually not a pious representative of the religious tradition. And why? Well, because the tradition is to take in new gods. But Pentheus scoffs at the, quote, latest divinity. But why should he scoff at such a thing? I mean, seen from the Hellenic point of view, that's a completely impious attitude. It would be one thing if Pentheus were the old man, set in his ways. That would be a more adequate representative of the social and political and religious order. But he's not. He's a beardless boy, right? The two old men, who would be a better candidates for the symbols of the old order, are willing to go and worship Dionysus. Pentheus is really a young hormonal teenager, and what we see in his character is not an old religious order, it is in fact skepticism. Pentheus is a skeptic. Perhaps he's even a familiar type to us modern people. He's the young, skeptical, doubting mind. He's the one who challenges what he sees as the foolishness of the older traditional types with their superstitions. He's perhaps indicative of what Tiresias called the quibbling logic of this age with its clever subtleties. So even though the Greek mythos is full of stories of Zeus begetting gods and demigods with mortal women, Pentheus says no, there's a perfectly rational explanation as to what happened that doesn't involve a new deity that I have to go worship. He considers the stranger, this priest of a foreign religion, as a mere charlatan. Again, we might see similarities to a modern skeptical mindset here, a la James Randi or someone like that, who goes around exposing gurus and fortune tellers and magicians. Again, Pentheus's skepticism here, if we accept the sort of the standard fare of Greek mythology of Zeus begetting demigods regularly, it's not really that unbelievable that there might be some new divinity you have to worship. So that just indicates that Pentheus is not coming from the old religious mindset or framework. And when Pentheus sees Tiresias and Cadmus wearing the garb of Dionysus, he is furious. He yells at Cadmus to drop the Thyrsus. He yells that Tiresias is the culprit who has manipulated his grandfather into this. He calls these Dionysian mysteries filthy, and he rebukes the two old men for the fact that wine is drunk during the ritual. And again, he makes references to the Bacchantes as sexually loose and thus immoral, clearly not representatives of a god. Again, the fact that Pentheus is such a moralist might seem to place him on the side of, religious conservatives. But we might remember, one of Nietzsche's critiques of the theoretical turn in the Hellenic world is that moralism comes with the territory, that the Socratic approach to life is necessarily both rooted in reason and in virtue. Reason and virtue are, in fact, inextricable. Nietzsche says in his lectures that this is the key insight or innovation of Socrates, that reason equals virtue equals happiness. So in other words, we have to look at this the way a Greek would. The Greeks certainly had a moral order, but this wasn't based on something like a rational approach to managing the social life of the polity. which is maybe the way we would think of a moral order. We wouldn't even probably put it in those terms, but that's what it is. Rather, it was rooted in religious worship, which is inherently irrational on some foundational level. What I mean by that is that religion doesn't establish itself based on reason. And so, furthermore, within the demands of a god might be acts which are normally considered immoral, or unseemly, or even insane. I mean, consider the worship of Cybele, in which her male disciples castrate themselves. In the normal Greek context, where so much of a man's value is based on his virility, his ability to establish a family line, and so on, castrating yourself is an act of insanity. But in the context of a religious worship, it becomes pious. And so yet again, in spite of all Nietzsche's criticism of Euripides, you can read this story as Pentheus standing for a prototypical version of the young, like we might say, the incipient theoretical mindset that is dawning on Greece, and Dionysus representing, quite frankly, the Dionysian. The theoretical approach is known for denying the Dionysian, and Nietzsche's assertion or allegation is that it's the destruction of culture that occurs when the Dionysian is excised. And that's what happens, is the destruction of the house of Cadmus. And so you can actually read a very Nietzschean theme into the story that he apparently hated. And so that's another reason why I think modern-day Nietzscheans should be a bit easier on Euripides. But so Tiresias then reprimands Pentheus for his foolishness. And he says a rather remarkable thing in the course of this long speech that he gives. He says there are two great gods who gave mankind two supreme blessings. The first is Demeter, or Earth, who gave man nourishment of grain. The second was Dionysus, the son of Semele, who gave us wine. And so while he doesn't invoke Cybele, by invoking Demeter and associating her with the earth itself, he's hearkening to these many goddess figures that fill the archetype of the Great Mother, our Mother Earth, by whose blessings we are able to feed ourselves. And a large reason why Cybele did not figure into the Eleusinian mysteries, for example, is because those mysteries already had a mother figure in the form of Demeter. So they would have filled the same role. There was no room for Cybele to come into the Eleusinian mysteries. The interesting thing about this speech of Tiresias is that the second great blessing mankind received was from the youngest and newest god, Dionysus. Wine gives mankind many things. In wine we forget our grief and we find oblivion. But its chief blessing is that it is with libations that we honor the god. In this way, Dionysus is the intercessor between man and heaven. By giving us wine, Dionysus allows us to honor the gods. Quote, "When we pour libations to the gods, we pour the god of wine himself, that through his intercession man may win the favor of heaven." End quote. And who does that sound like? Just if we had to compare Dionysus to another great world religious figure, I mean, there's a reason why Dionysus is compared to Christ very often. That's another god who intercedes on behalf of mankind to reunite him with the divine. And in Christianity, it is by a ritual of communion, that is coming together, communing with God, which involves wine. And the wine is the deity himself in both cases. It's literally the blood of Christ, or here, as Tiresias says, wine is literally Dionysus himself. Now, obviously, there's a very different sense to both deities serving as intercessor. In the case of Jesus, it's to relieve man's guilt, to relieve man's sin, to deliver him from death. In the case of Dionysus, it is to establish this reciprocal relation of worship between oneself and gods that are essentially seen as one's distant ancestors in some way. And this is how Dionysus can be the youngest deity simultaneously, and one of the two most important, insofar as he is one of the two who blessed mankind most greatly. And I guess I would put it forward that his entry into the pantheon is perhaps as revolutionary for the existing religion as the deification of Christ would be for, say, the religion of Judaism. That is to say that the nature of the Hellenic religion before and after Dionysus are just as different as Judaism is from Christianity. Perhaps. It may, I would, even as I utter it, I realize that statement is perhaps a bit extreme. But if we were to, let's just say it like this. If we were to take Tiresias at his word in this speech, in this play, right? before the time of Dionysus would be a time before the Greeks have the ability to pour libations for the gods. How are they then to give them offerings? How are they to establish a relationship with the gods? How are they then to attain the gods' protections, right? So Tiresias is placing Dionysus in the speech in a position of supreme importance. Perhaps more importantly, as Tiresias continues to criticize Pentheus, is that just as he said that Oedipus was really the one who was blind, which is an irony because Tiresias is physically blind, he says that Pentheus is really the one who is mad. He says, quote, "grievously mad, beyond the power of any drugs to cure, for you are drugged with madness," end quote. And it is worth noting that he says this after admitting, seemingly, that Dionysus does make his followers become, at least temporarily, mad. Quote, "his worshippers, like madmen, are endowed with mantic powers," end quote. And further down he says, quote, "at times you see an army mustered under arms, stricken with panic before it lights a spear. This panic comes from Dionysus," end quote. And, of course, the term panic comes from the god Pan, which has somewhat of a relationship to the god Dionysus, which we don't have to get into here. We've talked about it in past episodes of the podcast. So, philosophically speaking, what Tiresias is getting at in this polemic against Penthean skepticism is that pure skeptical rationalism is itself irrational, because it denies the unreason that sits at the base of reason, we might say. Nietzsche explains this in explicit philosophical terms very well in Beyond Good and Evil, but Tiresias gets at it here by referring to the customs and traditions of the Greek religion, the received wisdom of incredible stories and deeds and magical occurrences, upon which, it must be said, the entire social order is based. The Greek religion accepts and respects the power of divine madness. With this madness comes, for example, the breath of prophecy, the religious institutions of the oracular priests, the sibyls. Even Socrates admits this in the Phaedrus. He says there's 4 kinds of divine madness, and he classifies these sort of the breath of prophecy, as Tiresias puts it here, as one of those forms, and the Dionysian madness as another. So by denying that the true divinity would inspire madness in his worshippers, one would be slandering the divine, since the divinity always has the power to bring man beyond the normal, ordinary state of mind. We might say that the ability to inspire madness, insofar as madness is defined as not perceiving the world the way we ordinarily do, is a key feature of the divine. Every religious experience, in some sense, is being brought into a state of madness in order to experience something which is supramundane. And after Tiresias is done speaking, the leader of the Bacchic chorus, praises him and says, "Tiresias is wise to honor the great god Bromius." And then Cadmus says something else that might raise an eyebrow. He tries to further convince Pentheus to join in with the worship. Quote, "even if this Dionysus is no god, as you assert, persuade yourself that he is. The fiction is a noble one, for simile will seem to be the mother of a god, and this confers no small distinction on our family," end quote. And while these words might simply be an attempt at persuasion, they might offer further explanation for why Cadmus is as guilty as all the other Thebans. It stands to question whether he himself really believes that Dionysus is a god. And we might wonder, was this the nature of his honoring of simile, his apparent eagerness to worship Dionysus? Not that he really believes, but that it will raise the esteem of his house. Remember, Dionysus' goal, as he tells us in the beginning, and as Tiresias also echoes, is to convert actual worshippers, to make himself known as a deity, to make all acknowledge that he is a deity. And so, if he has worshippers who are simply going through the motions because they think, well, it'll look good for our image as a family, or even if he's not, we might as well do it just to, go along with what everyone else is doing, that's not true acknowledgement. That's not true recognition of his divinity. And so how do you get true recognition of your divinity? Again, the only way might be through punishment. That's, as I've often said, human beings have to learn everything the hard way. We usually don't learn unless there's some pain. In any case, Pentheus is not convinced, and he's even more furious. He sends the two old men off. He says, "Fine, go worship your Bacchus, get out of my sight." And he tells his soldiers to search the city for this stranger and bring him here. Tiresias and Cadmus depart the stage, and Pentheus returns to the palace. The Asian Bacchae then give a very interesting series of verses foretelling the danger that Pentheus is bringing on himself and chastising him for his undue ambition. And it's interesting because they seem to give voice to an ethos that runs counter to the Greek competitive spirit, in which all attempt to outstrive one another for greatness. It would seem to be a definitive aspect of the Greek spirit. But the Bacchae say, contrary to this, quote, "What passes for wisdom is not. Unwise are those who aspire, who outrange the limits of man. Briefly we live, briefly then die. Wherefore, I say, he who hunts a glory, he who tracks some boundless superhuman dream, may lose his harvest here and now and garner death. Such men are mad, their counsels evil." End quote. So once again, the Bacchae, the representatives of this god of ritual madness, condemn others by calling them mad. But more importantly, they seem to reject glory-seeking in favor of humility. There are a couple ways we could take these lines. On the one hand, Dionysus is a rustic deity. He's a common deity. That's one of his defining features. At the Dionysian ritual, all are simply Greek. Rank and station are forgotten. One returns to a primordial consciousness. Dionysus says this at the beginning. He says, Agave and Ino and Atanue are out there wandering in the mountains with all the women of Thebes, rich and poor alike. They no longer recognize those distinctions. So it's another way in which the social order is disrupted or leveled. So perhaps the Asian Bacchae are expressing this aspect of Dionysus as what might be seen as a true countercurrent against Greek ambition. We could read these lines as truly opposed to the Greek spirit, and perhaps they would be, as this is an Asian foreign cult. And this is reinforced by the concluding lines of the chorus in this scene, quote, "What the common people do, the things that simple men believe, I too believe and do," end quote. So again, perhaps another reason Nietzsche had a problem with Euripides. But the other way we could take this is perhaps more literally. The one who attempts to outrange the limits of man, to track after a boundless, superhuman dream, is mad. And this could be read as a simple statement of fact that the gods are beyond the human. One could strive to be the greatest human, but you still have to remember how you stand in relation to the gods. We might think of Agamemnon trampling the sacred tapestries, an act of hubris that would seem to set him, a mortal king, above the Olympians. So there is a sense in which the Bacchae are simply saying, this is what Pentheus is doing. He is an unwise, defiant, petulant young man who does not understand his place in regard to the divinity. He thinks he can defy a god simply because the god is the youngest, forgetting how much farther the gods stand above all mankind. In the following scene, the captured stranger is brought before Pentheus by his guards. They tell Pentheus that he did not resist but came willingly. However, while they were catching him, the maenads that they had previously caught all escaped the dungeon. Their chains simply unlocked themselves, it seems, and the doors opened on their own. And the guard warns Pentheus, quote, "This stranger who has come to Thebes is full of miracles. I know no more than that. The rest is your affair," end quote. So already even Pentheus' own men are beginning to acknowledge that there's something mysterious going on here, and they don't really want to be responsible for Pentheus' actions. Pentheus then interrogates his prisoner. He asks him who he is and where he is from, and the stranger says, "I'm from Lydia. I've come to import the worship of Dionysus, son of Zeus." And Pentheus says, "Well, what, you have some foreign Zeus that begets gods?" And Dionysus says, "No, it was the Greek Zeus, who had a child with Semele." He says that he has introduced his rites all over Asia. Quote, "Foreigners everywhere now dance for Dionysus," end quote. Pentheus asks who initiated him into these rites, and the stranger says, "By Dionysus himself," Pentheus asks, was this a dream or a vision? And Dionysus, in the guise of the stranger, says, no, it was face to face that Dionysus gave me these rights. When Pentheus asks what form Dionysus assumed, the stranger tells him, quote, whatever form he wished, the choice was his, not mine, end quote. Pentheus becomes fed up with answers like this. He calls it an evasion. And he shears off the stranger's curls, then takes his Tiresias and imprisons him in the stables by the palace. The stranger says, that's fine, quote, the god himself will set me free whenever I wish, end quote. Pentheus mocks this as well and asks in so many words, where's your god now? And the stranger says, quote, with me, your blasphemies have made you blind, end quote. And he goes on to say, it would be a mistake to put chains on me, but Pentheus says, I'm the stronger party here, and I say chain him. Just before the guards are about to carry him off, Dionysus continues, quote, you do not know the limits of your strength. You do not know what you do. You do not know who you are, end quote. Those are the kind of things that you might say to a madman. As, for example, Foucault reports in his book Madness and Civilization, it's not uncommon to find people in the asylum who will claim to be the emperor or the son of God himself. What would we say of such people? We might say, you don't know the limits of your strength. You don't know who you are. So, again, is the Bacchae a play about madness overwhelming sanity? It certainly seems to be about that. Or is Pentheus himself, the king, a figure of madness, blinded by his skepticism, by his blasphemous attitude, unable to see the god who is right in front of him? Has Pentheus been the one who is mad from the start? I mean, this is a recurrent theme throughout this play, that the Bacchae and Dionysus in the guise of the strange priest call the people who deny the power of Dionysus mad. It's a very strange reversal, because they would seem to stand for madness, but they're constantly saying, you're the ones who are insane, because you're not acknowledging these, because it would seem to imply, if these miracles are real, then you should believe in them. The insane thing is to deny them. And yet we have to keep in mind, a god is not what is right in front of Pentheus, right? We know that it's a god. But from Pentheus's perspective, a human being is what is in front of him. That is who Pentheus sees. And why is that? Is that Pentheus's fault? Well, no, Dionysus has woven the illusion that he's a mere mortal. He's not actually revealed himself as a god, and has in fact lied to Pentheus throughout the exchange by misrepresenting his identity, speaking of the god as though it were someone else. The stranger says, the god Dionysus gave me the rights. He gave them to me face to face. But meanwhile, Pentheus is face to face with a god, and the reason he can't see that is because Dionysus is choosing to appear in a different form other than the divine. And so when the stranger, who is actually Dionysus, says, well, the god took any form he wanted. The choice was his, not mine. He's also saying, I'm taking whatever form I please, and the choice of how you see me, how I appear to Pentheus, is not the choice of Pentheus. So, in one sense, he's telling Pentheus exactly what's going on by telling him Dionysus can appear in whatever form he wishes. He's a god of illusion. And yet, he's also maintaining an illusion, which it really can't be said to start with or end with Pentheus's stubborn skepticism. It's really not Pentheus's choosing at all. It's Dionysus choosing to deceive Pentheus. And Pentheus has no power to perceive Dionysus as a god, even if he wanted to, right? If the god chooses to appear as a mortal man, then Pentheus has to perceive him as a mere mortal, because the power of illusion that Dionysus possesses, how could that be overcome by Pentheus's merely mortal eyes? And even as he's being carried off, clapped in chains, Dionysus never says, well, you've made a mistake because I'm actually the god himself. What he says instead is, quote, I go, though not to suffer, since that cannot be. But Dionysus, whom you outrage by your acts, who you deny is God, will call you to account. When you set chains on me, you manacle the god. End quote. So, even in these words, he comes right up to admitting that they're one and the same, but still he maintains the deception. It's not I, a mere mortal whom you outrage, but the god himself. Spoken of as if he were a separate entity. Spoken of as if I, his mortal servant, cannot suffer. The god in some way is suffering because of your disrespect to his mortal servant. But the god is the one being clapped in irons, so there's no mortal servant being disrespected, if that makes sense. So, indeed, Pentheus was making a mistake in attempting to imprison the stranger. There's no doubt about that, but it's very ambiguous as to how Pentheus could have seen through the illusion, or whether that is even possible. Now, shortly thereafter, there's thunder, the earth itself trembles, and the palace of Pentheus collapses as lightning strikes it, and flames shoot up from the grave of Semele. The chorus expresses their awe at this turn of events, and they fall to the ground in prostration in direction of the palace. They say that Dionysus himself is within. And they don't mean the mortal form of Dionysus, who's impersonating the priest. They mean, oh, the god is here. Look, the way that we know the god is here is that the power of Dionysus has to be what has destroyed the palace. But then Dionysus in his mortal form appears from within the rubble. And his tone is completely nonchalant, completely unserious. It approaches the level of banter. He says, quote, "What, women of Asia? Were you so overcome with fright that you fell to the ground? I think you must have seen how Bacchus jostled the palace of Pentheus. But come, rise, do not be afraid." End quote. So he continues to speak of Dionysus as a separate power from himself. The leader of the chorus is overjoyed at seeing their priest, and they ask how he escaped. And the stranger says, "It was easy. In fact, Pentheus never even chained me. Even that was an illusion." Quote, "He seemed to think that he was chaining me, but never once so much as touched my hands." End quote. When the guards thought that they were tying up the stranger in the stable, instead it was a bull made to appear as the stranger. Dionysus, as the stranger, then continues speaking, quote, "At that moment Bacchus came, shook the palace, and touched his mother's grave with tongues of fire. Imagining the palace was in flames, Pentheus went rushing here and there, shouting to his slaves to bring him water. Every hand was put to work in vain. Then, afraid I might escape, he suddenly stopped short, drew his sword, and rushed to the palace. There, it seems, Bromius had made a shape, a phantom which resembled me, within the court. Bursting in, Pentheus thrust and stabbed at that thing of gleaming air, as though he thought it me. And then once again the god humiliated him. He razed the palace to the ground where it lies, shattered in utter ruin, his reward for my imprisonment. At that bitter sight, Pentheus dropped his sword, exhausted by the struggle. A man, and nothing more. Yet he presumed to wage a war with a god. For my part, I left the palace quietly and made my way outside. For Pentheus, I care nothing." End quote. Once again, even when speaking to his own worshippers, Dionysus refers to all of these miracles as though they were acts of the god himself, and he uses different names for each of these acts. He says, "For my part, I simply slipped out of the palace while the god was working these miracles." But then he uses the multiple names of Dionysus as he explains what happened, and meanwhile, the god seems to be in multiple places at once, doing many things at once. And there are also multiple layers of illusion here. So Pentheus thinks he's chaining up Dionysus because he thinks Dionysus is a mortal man, but he's in fact chaining up a bull, which, by the way, is one of the animal forms in which Dionysus was said to appear. And then when Pentheus rushes to the palace, he sees a phantom, which is the work of the god himself, Bromius, or Dionysus. But the phantom is an illusory image of the human form of Dionysus. So both the bull and the phantom are an illusion of an illusion, because the human form of Dionysus is not the true form of Dionysus. That's also an illusion. So are those is Pentheus perceiving the true form, a truer form of Dionysus, by attacking these illusions? Because these illusions at least seem to be more, what would we say, more like obviously godlike, or more obviously the products of a god, than the way that the stranger appears, who just appears as a mortal man. I mean, seeing a phantom or seeing what you thought was a man transform into a bull, that would seem to be evidence of a god, right? That would seem to be much clearer evidence of a god. But what they in fact are is actually illusions of an illusion. So, meanwhile, there's a divine power sending lightning, shaking the palace, and eventually razing it to the ground. But earlier, Dionysus said, well, I created the mere illusion that the palace was on fire. He says they poured water on it in vain. But then, after all of this, the palace actually burns down and collapses. So it was an illusion of something that was actually happening. And meanwhile, the only phenomenon that would seem to unquestionably be the power of the divine, from the Greek mindset anyway, would be the strike of lightning, the shaking of the earth. Those are, in some sense, the classical signs of the work of a god, right? Lightning from the sky and the chthonic power of shaking the earth, right? But we don't see who does those things. Those remain the work of an unseen force. So, which one's the real Dionysus? Is it the unseen force, which is most manifestly the power of the divine? Or is it the illusionary figure playing at being a man? One might be tempted to say that the god of illusions reveals himself precisely by appearing in the form of illusions. That the deep meaning of Dionysus's line that saying, he appeared in whatever form he wished, I had no choice in it, is that Dionysus can only appear in a given quote-unquote form. That he is a god who appears. Appearance, necessarily, is never noumenal. It's sort of a tautology to say that, but we never see the essence of the god, the noumenal form of the god, the quote-unquote true form of the god. Because, allegorically speaking, what happened to Semele when she beheld the true form of a god? It obliterated her. But this is the greatness of Dionysus. By the very fact of being the god of illusion, he can appear to us as an illusion. And this aspect of Dionysus, that he manipulates the world of appearance, the world as we sense it, means that he can reveal himself to the world in a way that Zeus cannot. He reveals himself in the very act of fooling our senses. Pentheus seems almost dazed. He stumbles back onto the scene, and he has a brief interaction with Dionysus, where he asks how he escaped, and Dionysus says, well, I told you that God would free me. And Pentheus still doesn't believe. He still rages against this Bacchic cult, and he renews his commitment to hunt them down and destroy them. But then a messenger arrives. He's a villager from Kithaeron, and he tells of what transpired when he and several others, who were cowherds and shepherds, caught sight of the Maenads who were roaming in the woods there. He says that the Bacchae are split into 3 groups, each led by one of the daughters of Cadmus, Ino, Atanue, and Pentheus's mother, Agave. The villagers watched as they wakened from their slumber, as though they were herds of wild animals. By merely tapping their thyrsus on the ground, they made springs of milk and honey and wine appear, seemingly at will. Quote, if you had been there and seen these wonders for yourself, you would have gone down on your knees and prayed to the god you now deny. End quote. Then one of the men suggested that they try to earn the favor of King Pentheus by capturing Agave, his mother. But when they tried to do so, Agave cried out, quote, hounds who run with me, men are hunting us down. Follow me, use your hands as weapons, end quote. According to the messenger, they then barely escape being torn to pieces. The women descend on a herd of cattle and rip them to shreds with their bare hands. Then they attack one of the villages in the foothills of the Kithaeron. Quote, everything in sight they pillaged and destroyed, end quote. And the messenger then recounts how everything about this attack is supernatural, like indisputably supernatural. When the women grab for plunder, it stays on their backs without having to be tied to them. When spears hit them, it doesn't wound them. But when they stab at the men with their wands, they rend flesh and inflict wounds. They're unburned by flames. They have superhuman strength and agility, and they rout the male warriors and sack these towns. And the messenger concludes with the sentiment, this has to be the work of the greatest god of all. And the leader of the chorus agrees. She echoes, yes, Dionysus is the greatest god. So again, it would seem rational at this point to yield. It seems that all of Pentheus's men are not even really with him on this anymore. They all seem to believe far more easily than he does. Some divinity is at work here. But Pentheus's response is that they simply need to send in the hoplites. They need men with heavier armor. They need cavalry and archers. In light of everything he's been told, I'm inclined to agree with the Bacchae and with Dionysus. This response is insane. Pentheus continues to threaten Dionysus in his mortal form, saying, hey, don't make me imprison you again. And he promises to slaughter all the Maenads at Kithaeron. Even if he could succeed in this, that's also kind of insane. Would he be slaughtering? All of the women in the city, including his mother and his aunts? And so Dionysus, in this mortal form as a foreign priest, effectively acts as the voice of reason. He tries to dissuade Pentheus from this course of action, and he says, you can still save the situation. And there's a lengthy back and forth, but eventually what Dionysus uses to win Pentheus over is the temptation of witnessing the rites for himself. And Dionysus sort of draws out this voyeuristic desire of Pentheus, in spite of all of his moral condemnations of the Bacchic ritual. He asked Dionysus about the rites earlier, and Dionysus told him, well, the uninitiated cannot know them. And now Pentheus says, even though it would be shameful to see all these women in such a drunken state, he's still quite curious about it. And Dionysus gets him to confess. It is a passionate curiosity. And he further convinces him that if he goes to watch the women from a hiding place, that would be unwise, because if they spot him, Pentheus will be killed. So instead, he convinces him to go in a disguise. He should dress up as though he were one of the women himself. Pentheus is very resistant to this idea. He says it will be shameful, but Dionysus says the only alternative is fighting them, in which case there will be bloodshed. He says, I promise you, I can bring them back to your city without bloodshed. Pentheus doesn't quite believe this. He thinks it's a trap, but Dionysus says, well, at least go and reconnoiter first before you act. What harm could that do? And Pentheus says he'll have to decide whether to send in his men or take the advice of the priest. And when he leaves to deliberate, Dionysus addresses his chorus. And here he reveals that it is a trap. Once again, he invokes Dionysus as a separate entity from himself, calling on him, quote, punish this man. But first, distract his wits, bewilder him with madness. For sane of mind, this man would never wear a woman's dress, but obsess his soul, and he will not refuse. I want him made the laughingstock of Thebes, paraded through the streets, a woman. Now I shall go and costume Pentheus in the clothes which he must wear to Hades when he dies, butchered by the hands of his mother. End quote. So there's that trope in Greek tragedy of being told exactly what's going to happen. Pentheus will be killed by his own mother. But again, things are not so straightforward as Dionysus simply punishing Pentheus for disobeying him or something to that effect, because at this point in the play, Pentheus is ultimately undone by the fact that he finally seems to see reason and finally listens to Dionysus, listens to this strange priest, and says, what must I do? Guide me. The reasonable thing at this point would be to listen to this man, who seems to have some special connection with the god, and to take his counsel, because at this point, the insane thing would be to deny the god and continue in your skepticism. But when Pentheus finally does this, Dionysus counsels him only so he can further humiliate him. Pentheus has been wrong about everything in this play, but the first thing he's been right about is the fact that this is a trap. And when he finally takes Dionysus' counsel, he manages to convince him that it's not a trap. He manages to convince him to do the wrong thing so that he can continue to degrade and destroy him as a show of his own power. It calls to mind the story in the Old Testament about the plagues of Egypt, where the Pharaoh initially resisted acknowledging the power of Yahweh because of his pride or something of that nature. But as the plagues begin, the Pharaoh almost immediately recognizes, oh no, I have angered a powerful God. I really should repent. But the Bible tells us God hardened the Pharaoh's heart, that God himself intercedes to stop the Pharaoh from repenting, presumably so he can keep punishing Egypt, keep the plagues going. It's already been foretold. It's already been prophesied. This is what's going to happen. So you actually can't get out of it. And so it would be a mistake to read that story as like, oh, well, the point is that the Pharaoh should have repented, because no, God stops him from repenting. And so it's a similar dynamic here. Dionysus finally manages to convince Pentheus of something, but he uses the power of persuasion to further destroy Pentheus, which calls into question whether the point of the story is that, oh, well, Pentheus should have seen reason sooner. In some sense, I get the impression that that isn't really possible. Dionysus has made that impossible throughout this entire play, throughout this entire encounter. And so Pentheus emerges from the palace again, or I guess the ruins of the palace, now in drag. And Dionysus says, "You look just like the daughters of Cadmus." And Pentheus now seems to be fully enthralled to the power of Dionysus. He's seeing another reality entirely. He says, quote, "I seem to see two suns blazing in the heavens, and now two Thebes, two cities, and each with 7 gates. And you are a bull who walks before me there. Horns have sprouted from your head. Have you always been a beast? But now I see a bull." End quote. And Dionysus answers him, quote, "It is the god you see. Though hostile formerly, he now declares a truce and goes with us. You see what you could not when you were blind." End quote. So, Pentheus sees a bull in place of Dionysus's human form, whereas before he saw Dionysus's human form in place of a bull, when he tried to shackle Dionysus but shackled a bull instead. So Dionysus says, well, you see that because God is with us, and it's the God that you see. So, does this mean Dionysus is actually a bull? He's saying, look, you see past the illusion I showed you earlier, when you thought you were chaining me, but it was actually a bull. It's not that his true form is that of a bull, it's that both appearances were merely appearances. The detail about Pentheus seeing double would seem to comment on the power of wine. The fact that while intoxicated, we get double vision. That's one of the ways that Dionysus fools our senses. And so Pentheus sees 2 suns, he sees 2 cities. Is that actually the reality? No, but it's precisely because he's now seeing the warped reality brought about by the Dionysian that he's finally seeing the god. And further, Dionysus continues to just lie to him by saying that the god is called a truce. That is a lie because he's leading Pentheus to his execution. No truce has really been called. So Dionysus tells him, you were blind before to deny the god. Now you see clearly by acknowledging him. But this statement is a complete reversal of reality. Pentheus is now blinder than ever. Dionysus then helps Pentheus sort of get his costume together. He says, here, let me be your maid. I'll help you. Dionysus says, we'll be the best of friends after this, which is another lie. And Pentheus begins acting effeminately in this scene. He's becoming absorbed in this false role to an almost unbelievable degree, like where we would have to believe that his mind is just simply being warped. He says he's been dancing and shaking his head in joy, which is why Dionysus had to help get his costume back together again. So Pentheus is not just donning the outfit, he's very quickly becoming the role. And Pentheus says, as he holds his thyrsus, quote, could I lift Kithaeron up, do you think? Shoulder the cliffs, Bacchae and all, end quote. Dionysus answers, if you wanted. Your mind was unsound, but now you think as sane men do, end quote. So he's driven Pentheus mad and is now telling him that he's saner than ever before. And, the funny thing is, Pentheus is asking if he could lift up an entire mountain. Like, that would be an insane question to ask, but he's asking that question for a reason. It's precisely because that is one of the miraculous things that the Bacchae have done. If I'm truly to become one of them, could I have these same supernatural powers? That would seem to be an almost logical deduction if we're now accepting the power of this new god. And Dionysus confirms this, but it's all a lie. So, again, Dionysus has spent the whole play so far trying to get Pentheus to believe by these demonstrations of his power. But when Pentheus finally begins to believe and naturally imagines that these powers will accompany his belief, that's yet another illusion. It's another fooling of the senses. So, when Pentheus reverses course and begins to believe, that too is part of his destruction, which there's almost a sense of injustice in the fact that when Pentheus says to Dionysus, I'm in your hands entirely, that Dionysus would take this man who has effectively surrendered to him and compound the pain of his death by further denigrating him. And this scene ends with some lines that would seem to reveal openly to Pentheus what fate awaits him. Dionysus says, quote, "A great ordeal awaits you, but you are worthy of your fate. I shall lead you safely there. Someone else shall bring you back." End quote. Pentheus says, quote, "Yes, my mother," end quote. And of course, what the actual meaning is here is that Agave will bring back the head of Pentheus after killing him. But Pentheus seems to be speaking as though he believes his mother and he will return together alive, that he'll be cradled in his mother's arms. And Dionysus continues, quote, "You are an extraordinary young man, and you go to an extraordinary experience," end quote. Even in saying things that are true, Dionysus deceives Pentheus until the very end, because there's double entendres that lace throughout this entire final interaction between the two of them that we see. Now, we don't see the fate of Pentheus. This is a Greek drama, obviously. That's not how things go. We just hear about it later. So a messenger who witnessed what happened comes to Thebes. He says he went up with Pentheus and the stranger, who's actually Dionysus, to Kithaeron. Pentheus complained that he could not see the Maenads clearly, so the stranger worked a miracle. He bent a fir tree down to earth as though it were a bow. Pentheus climbed onto the tree, and then it slowly lifted itself back up. And as soon as he was at the top of the tree, the Maenads spotted him. And then a great voice came that the messenger says had to have been Dionysus. Quote, "Women, I bring you the man who has mocked at you and me and at our holy mysteries. Take vengeance upon him." End quote. Another kind of strange concept, right? Because are the Bacchae on the mountain being punished by Dionysus, or are they his true adherents? They've mocked our holy mysteries. That would certainly seem to imply that these Bacchae are part of the Dionysian cult now. But regardless of either way we want to interpret that, the Maenads then surround the tree, and with Pentheus unable to escape, they tear the fir down. They pull him to earth. He sobs and screams as he falls, and his own mother, Agave, approaches him and tears off his wig. And he begs her, quote, "No, mother, I am Pentheus, your own son. Pity me, spare me, mother. I have done a wrong, but do not kill your own son for my offense." End quote. But the messenger recounts, quote, "But she was foaming at the mouth, and her crazed eyes rolled with frenzy. She was mad, stark mad, possessed by Bacchus. Ignoring his cries of pity, she seized his left arm at the wrist. Then planting her foot on his chest, she pulled, wrenching away the arm at the shoulder. Not by her own strength, for the god had put inhuman power in her hands." End quote. And shortly thereafter, the entire horde of Maenads descends upon Pentheus and rips him to shreds. They then played with scraps of his body, throwing his bones and body parts around like they were playing ball games, and the messenger knows the incredible sorrow that Agave will feel as soon as she is returned to her right mind, and as he is unwilling to stick around for that, he says, "I'm now going to leave," before Agave returns and realizes what she's truly done. The chorus celebrates this outcome. They declare they shall dance to the glory of Bacchus and to the death of Pentheus. Agave then enters the scene, drenched in blood, carrying the head of Pentheus on her thyrsus. She believes at the moment that it is the head of a mountain lion, and she interacts with the chorus, and they recognize her as a fellow reveler. And Agave says, "Happy was the hunting," and she seems naively to believe that the men of the house of Cadmus, including her son, will praise her when they see what a great hunter she is. She displays the head of Pentheus before all Thebes, quote, "You citizens of this towered city, men of Thebes, behold the trophy of your women's hunting. This is the quarry of our chase, taken not with nets nor spears of bronze, but by the white and delicate hands of women. What are they worth, your boastings now, and all that uselessness your armor is, since we, with our bare hands, captured this quarry and tore its bleeding body limb from limb? But where is my father Cadmus? He should come. And my son, where is Pentheus? Fetch him. I shall have him set his ladder up against the wall, and there upon the beam nail the head of this wild lion I have killed as a trophy of my hunt." End quote. It bears no further explanation the way in which Agave is completely out of her mind in this scene. calling for Pentheus to help mount the head of Pentheus. But I suppose I could put it this way. I mean, almost every single major character in this play is tricked by Dionysus into seeing the world falsely. So, for example, when the men of Kithaeron witness the power of the Maenads and their wild frenzies, is that a vision of quote-unquote the truth? Well, ordinarily, naked, unarmed women can't rip cows apart with their bare hands, or pass through flames unharmed. And the Maenads themselves, are they experiencing the truth of the world when enthralled by Dionysus, when making honey bubble up from the ground? And so the displays of Dionysus's power are violations of the natural order, disruptions to the normal truths of life, that one would indeed be mad for believing in. And in fact, it seems as if the destruction of Thebes and the death of Pentheus, all of this was preordained. Dionysus had decided upon this display of his power as a punishment for the entire city. And even though Agave and her sisters seemed to be his allies in this, he intended their Dionysian madness as a punishment in addition to the induction into the mysteries of his cult. But it is simultaneously a punishment. Pathemathos, learning through suffering. And so, again, there's just that sense in which we'd be unable to recognize Dionysus as a god except through his dispensing of divine punishment, and the way that he does this is by making us see the world as it is not. The main characters recognize this fact, finally. Agave and Cadmus have the following exchange near the end of the play. Quote, Agave, but what were we doing on the mountain? Cadmus, you were mad. The whole city was possessed. Agave, now I see. Dionysus has destroyed us all. Cadmus, you outraged him. You denied he was truly God. Agave, Father, where is my poor boy's body now? Cadmus, there it is. I gathered the pieces with great difficulty. And further down in the dialogue, Agave, but why should Pentheus suffer for my crime? Cadmus, he, like you, blasphemed the god, and so the god has brought us all to ruin at one blow. You, your sisters, and this boy. All our house the god has utterly destroyed, and with it me, for I have no sons left, no male heir. End quote. That's a discrepancy, by the way, since Laius, the king in Oedipus Rex, is a descendant of Cadmus, and other myths, Cadmus does have a son and heir. But I suppose we shouldn't expect all these stories to perfectly align. We should expect discrepancies between them. The important point to take away is that all are being punished. The entirety of the house of Cadmus and the entirety of the city of Thebes. They're all being punished for not recognizing Dionysus as a god from the very start. By the time you experience his power, it's too late. And Cadmus concludes that interaction by saying, quote, if there is still any mortal man who despises or defies the gods, let him look on this boy's death and believe in the gods. End quote. Dionysus then appears above the palace. Presumably, at this point, all the characters can behold him as a god in his full glory. At least, he finally identifies himself as such. Quote, I am Dionysus, the son of Zeus, returned to Thebes, revealed a god to men. But the men of Thebes blasphemed me. They slandered me. They said I came of mortal man, and not content with speaking blasphemies, they dared to threaten my person with violence. These crimes, this people whom I cherished well did from malice to their benefactor. Therefore, I now disclose the sufferings in store for them. End quote. He begins with Pentheus, who has already suffered his fate. Agave, Atanue, and Ino are all to be banished to foreign lands, having shamed themselves by killing their own countrymen, and in Agave's case, her own son. Cadmus and his wife Harmonia are to be turned into snakes. Dionysus also prophesies that they shall return leading an Asian army. But as Cadmus has been relatively pious towards Dionysus, at least since he arrived, and has at least given the appearance of worshipping him, and counseled Pentheus not to fight him, his fate is not quite as harsh. In the end, Dionysus says, Ares will save you and bring you and your wife to live among the blessed. So Cadmus, a great hero in the Greek mythos, is not to be handed some eternal punishment. Dionysus even goes so far as to say that this fate of Cadmus was decreed from the oracles of Zeus. And so in some way he's saying, look, it's your fate to become a snake and lead an Asian army, because that's what's been preordained. But in the end, you'll go to the Isles of the Blessed, which is a heavenly afterlife, relatively speaking. And Cadmus does sort of plea a case of forgiveness, primarily for his family, saying that it's too harsh. But this is how it goes. Quote, Cadmus, we implore you, Dionysus, we have done wrong. Dionysus, too late. When there was time, you did not know me. Cadmus, we have learned, but your sentence is too harsh. Dionysus, I am a god. I was blasphemed by you. Cadmus, gods should be exempt from human passions. Dionysus, long ago my father Zeus ordained these things. Agave, it is fated, father. We must go. End quote. So there it is again. This is destiny as much as it is a punishment. It may be a bit harsh, but that's what fate demands. It was necessary that such a punishment be carried out, and carried out against the whole house, the whole bloodline, the entirety of the family, indeed the entirety of the city. Thebes itself has to go through a terrible trial in order to encounter the Dionysian. And there are real destructive consequences to this, which may be necessary. But in the end, the theme the play emphasizes, it's a relatively boring virtue for us moderns, piety. This is perennially one of the great virtues of Greek life. That's why Fustel de Coulanges says, the myths of figures like Aeneas no longer resonate with us in the modern age quite as strongly because we can't understand what kind of a character Aeneas was. He's not really the warrior archetype who's the traditional model for the hero. Really, he's a priest. The virtue emphasized here is to believe even when one does not see. And so we might actually find some familiar Christian proverbs within this tale, some degree of overlap between Greek piety and Christian piety, and that might be that one should not tempt the Lord, or that while those who believe after seeing are blessed, how much more blessed are those who believe without seeing. And so one interpretation of the meaning of the Bacchae is simply that any time one recognizes a potentially divine power, don't test it. Have the good sense to worship it. So that's a very what might we say? Anti-knowledge, anti-reason, anti-free inquiry. It's, no, be willing to irrationally humble yourself before the divine. We'll end the reading with the final words of the Bacchic chorus after the house of Cadmus have all left in banishment. Quote, the gods have many shapes, the gods bring many things and their accomplishment. And what was most expected has not been accomplished. But God has found his way for what no man expected. So ends the play. End quote. So to conclude, I want to raise a possibility that Euripides was not only influenced by the likes of Socrates in the manner of introducing moralism into his plays or ordinary people as protagonists, that in fact the Bacchae is an example of a Euripidean drama that doesn't really fall into those categories. It isn't really a moral play, any more than the moral is that the gods are mighty, and might makes right after all. So don't slander a mighty god. But the fates of the main characters are more or less sealed before the play begins, because the city of Thebes failed to believe. And the characters in the play aren't really ordinary. It's the house of Cadmus, the one who slayed the dragon, the one who seeded the earth to grow great heroes. And it's his grandson against Dionysus, a literal god. The Bacchae is larger than life as a story, and it's every bit in the spirit of Greek tragedy that came before it, insofar as the main characters are extraordinary and they are doomed and can do nothing about it, no matter how they act over the course of the story. Even Cadmus is punished. And arguably, this is a far more tragic ending we see here than, say, that of the Eumenides, which ends on a relatively optimistic note. I think where Euripides' Socratic influence may come through in the themes of this play are actually to its great advantage. Socrates embodies the image of the philosopher whose role is to discern truth from appearance. The idea that the world as it appears is different from the world as it actually is. This idea goes back far before Socrates. We'd have to consider, for example, Pythagoras, Parmenides, and others. But Socrates really seizes upon the archetype of the philosopher as the one who knows the truth, who uses reason to gain access to an intelligible world that's hidden by the world of the senses. In the Bacchae, this distinction between truth and appearance is central. The characters are punished, but they're punished with madness, which means to see the world as it is not, to follow after appearances that trick our perception of the true world. And Dionysus repeatedly does this. Arguably, he does it throughout the entire play. And yet there's the sense that the characters learn through this calamitous experience. And so we might imagine it this way. As an ancient Greek was indoctrinated into the rites of Dionysus, the rituals of wine, dancing, music, initiation into the mysteries, potentially hallucinogenic or spiritual experiences, perhaps ego death, and so on. What happens is that one's ordinary perception of the world is distorted, maybe even destroyed. Perhaps in hallucinations, perhaps in seeing double while intoxicated, perhaps in simply going out of their minds in ecstasy, seeing the world of the senses dissolve. After this experience, after reflecting on this experience, one can see that they've been tricked by mere appearances. And so, by manipulating the world of phenomena, Dionysus shows us that it is just a world of phenomena. In order to have this experience, they have to suffer ego death. The city is destroyed. So allegorically, the palace, the house of Cadmus are destroyed. It symbolizes the destruction to the sense of self, the ego consciousness that must occur in order to have this perception, to be able to then reflect upon the frailty and fallibility of phenomena. And Dionysus therefore accomplishes what Zeus could not. He reveals himself to humanity as the god of illusion. But he can only do this by deceiving them with illusions, which means not revealing himself as a kind of essence, but revealing himself within the world of phenomena as the giver of false phenomena. This in itself is a religious experience. To be supremely deceived and to thereafter gain the wisdom to recognize that you are deceived. That's the Dionysian mystery. The revelation that your perception of the world, for whatever it is not an objective direct connection or correspondence with reality. At the very least, Dionysus reveals the possibility of that correspondence between sensation and reality being totally false. But if phenomena can be false, that indicates that there was some truth, that there was something that existed independently of the deceptive perception of reality, some truth which was covered over by one's senses. So by seeing how our perception is false, we gain a consciousness of the truth. This is the initiation of the protagonists of the Bacchae into the Dionysian mysteries. They pay a heavy cost for it, and all that is left to us, the audience, is the warning to honor the gods. That's all for this week, everyone. Next week, we conclude the first leg of the season before we return to revisit the gay science with Book 2. We're going to analyze a book that was inspired by both Nietzsche and the Bacchae. It's Donna Tartt and her novel, The Secret History. See you then. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.